I'm making this video to apply the law of implication to the e-commerce business model. So here's what we have. We have what's called a default situation, and you can imagine the default situation as acting by itself and producing certain results. And what we want to do is we want to transform the default situation in a way where it's impossible but to produce the desired result, which is money. So you can imagine so for example, a successful business model, let's say Amazon, it's like a fully fledged entity that has certain context, sort of like a building, right? So there's the foundation, and on top of the foundation there's the wall of the building, and inside this context, right? So the first context is the foundation, the second context is the walls, the third context would probably be the walls within the outer walls, right? And then we would have interior elements such as furniture, right? And then we would have, so interior elements would be the painting on the walls, and then the fifth element would be the furniture, and then the sixth element would be, you know, computers, papers, and all of that stuff, right? So in a sense, it's more like we're contextualizing something instead of the approach, which is let's get to the computer, so let's construct a part of the foundation, a part of the walls, a part of the interior design, right? And then we're gonna get there, right? So this is the approach that most people use, and it's wrong because it doesn't work, right? So we're trying to build layers of context in which there's inevitable success, right? And we're trying to get those contextual elements in our favor. So the first contextual thing that I was thinking about was to, of course, to start with something that's already working for somebody else. Now, in dropshipping, there is the particular structure is that there's an ad that links to a page that contains a product, it contains a price, and it contains sort of like other elements, right, we could say. Now, if we were to start from scratch, not start from a particular person that has success, the page might be excellent, right? But the ad may not. So if the ad is bad but the page is excellent, then the whole thing wouldn't work. And what we see when something is not working, we see that it's not working. We don't immediately know whether there's a problem with the ad where the problem is in the page. Now, sure, if there's an obvious thing such as, like, we have the ability to see whether, you know, the cost per click is huge. So then we might get an indication that the ad is the problem. However, there are other subtle elements, right? Let's take a scenario where the cost per click is very low and it still doesn't work. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with the page. It might still be a problem with the ad. And the problem might be subtle, such as the ad is filtering for non-buyers, right? So for example, the ad may be, well, here's a 50% off or an 88% off, and it might attract certain people that just are curious about what an offer like that looks like, not necessarily buyers, right? So on the face of it, the ad might seem good, but actually the problem is the ad, but we don't know, right? So a potential problem with the ad is that it's filtering for the bad audience. Now let's suppose that there was no problem with the ad and there also was no problem with the page. Now, in order for me to say that, I would, you know, need like a godlike perspective where I could judge things accurately, but I just stipulate in this particular scenario that it's not a problem. However, it's not successful. So then, if it's not the problem with the ad and not the problem with the page, what's the problem? Because the thing is not successful. So the hidden problem might be, right, and here is a scenario where I talk about the possibility of it being the saturation of the market, right? The saturation of the market doesn't have anything to do with the ad or with the page. It's some other contextual element that we're not seeing, but it might be the reason, right? Like if it's the end of a certain, right? If it's December, let's say, a late December, and everybody has already been buying ornaments for their Christmas tree, advertising ornaments for the Christmas tree is within the context of market saturation or fatigue, right? And what I'm basically saying is that there are other contextual elements which act as failure conditions, and we might not be aware of them, right? That's why there are other things invisible here, and there might also be invisible elements here. Now, one way to make, so that's why when somebody starts from zero, it's like a bunch of things that might be the failure conditions. And, you know, once we have experience in a domain, we might have seen what elements are important and what to focus on, what to test. But there are so many factors. That's why if something is unsuccessful, or let's say that this is losing money, right? And then we suppose that the problem might be the ad, and we split test a bunch of ads, but it's still not successful. Okay, and then we say, well, we tested a bunch of ads and it's still not successful, so the problem is not the ad. And then we say, okay, let's test the page, let's improve the page, let's split test the price, let's split test other elements, right? And it's still not successful. And then we go and say, okay, let's split test the targeting, and it's still not successful. And then we say, okay, let's split test, what else? Let's split test the country. And then it's successful, right? So the problem was the country. But the problem is that there was a lot of money wasted, until we figured out where the failure condition was, right? Essentially, for something to work, let's suppose that there are 50 contexts that need to be in place. And when I say a context, an ad could be a context, right? So the ad is not an element. So here's the difference between a context and the element. You can imagine a context being some sort of foundation. So it's sort of like the page operates in the context of the ad, because a particular ad will pre-frame the offer in a particular way, will filter people in a particular way, and it will also dictate the cost per click, which will dictate the necessary conversion rate in which there's going to be an acceptable cost per purchase such that the situation is profitable, right? So I'm going to say it again in the other way. If the situation is profitable, then that depends on the cost per purchase, which depends on the cost per click and the conversion rate. Now, if the cost per click is lower, then the conversion rate can be lower. If the cost per click is higher, the conversion rate has to be higher, right? So it's sort of like the conversion rate is dependent upon the cost per click such that the overall situation is profitable. So the ad acts like a context for the page, but also the page acts like a context for the ad, because if the page is excellent, then that dictates the fact that the ad doesn't necessarily need to be excellent, right? If the conversion rate is 50%, like 1 in 2 people buys, then the cost per click could be $15, which is huge, but the situation is still profitable, right? So my point is that every single bottleneck is a context in some sort of way, right? We can represent it as a context. So the law of implication talks about things that are called bottlenecks, or we can call them conditions, or we can call them frames. And the difference between an element in a context or a frame or a bottleneck is that we build stuff on the context that's already there. So for example, if the button is red or blue, that's not necessarily a context. It could be if it's significant enough, but first of all, we have to discover what are the important conditions or bottlenecks or context or frames that are influencing the overall thing. It's more like a multiplication thing instead of an addition thing. If you have 10 things that are multiplied with one another, if we modify one thing, it modifies the whole result in a holistic manner, right? So my point is that we got all of those conditions. We got conditions that we are aware of that play a significant role, which is the ad and the page, and then we have micro context within the page, which is the product, the price, and other important elements which act as contexts. So for example, one context within the product page, which is significant, is not necessarily the structure on the product page, like, okay, the headline is here, the description is here, right, the buttons are here. No, that's insignificant. The significant thing would be frames such as, does the page communicate that the seller is trustworthy, right? Does the page communicate that that the shipping will be 2 days instead of 20 days? Now, you see how when somebody is reading anything on the page, if they know that the shipping is 2 days, it acts such as a context for everything that they will read onwards. Whereas if somebody knows it's 20 days, it's going to act like a context. So for example, if there's a dress and people know that it's going to arrive in 2 days, then they mix that in with what they read. So let's say they read the fact that the dress is excellent and it impresses their peers, their friends, their people that they associate with. And then they might think, right, I'm going to wear this dress, right? But if it takes 2 days to arrive, it's more like, okay, I'm going to wear it in my party, which is in 5 days from now. Excellent. But if it's in 20 days, then they dismiss that particular upcoming situation in 5 days. And you see, like, the fact that it's excellent, they wouldn't mix that in with, oh, there's an upcoming event. But if it says it takes 20 days, then they can't mix that in, right? So the notion that there's a particular shipping time involved acts as a context through which they judge everything else, right? So there are a series of important frames or contexts within the product page, which are actually the important things which influence conversion, right? So it has nothing to do with how long is the description, what are the fonts, and all of those unimportant things, whether the headline is this many words or whatever, right? Those are surface level things that everybody sees, but they're not important. Like, one hugely important thing is whether or not the customer likes the seller, right? Because ultimately, if they really, really like the product and they really, really like the price, but if they hate the seller because it seems like, why do people hate other people, right? Because it feels like they're not like them. They have other value system. They have other priorities, right? Like in politics, right? If somebody's a conservative and somebody's a whatever Democrat, and if somebody reads the product page and he feels like, this product page is written by people that are Democrats and I'm a conservative, they won't buy just because the seller seems like it's not like them. So you see, that's a bottleneck. That's a contextual, that's a context. Like, people's minds want to understand the context that they're in. And there are those invisible things that makes people's minds calculate what context they're in. And if, for example, their minds calculate that it's a dangerous context, now you can see how their priorities, their likelihood of doing something changes, because now the context that their minds process, it's different. So we have to pay attention to a series of contexts, and we have to operate in them, and we have to solve one context at a time. And if we got all the context right, then there's success. And we don't need to get everything right at once, right? So back to this thing. If we got a series of contexts here that we're unaware of, and a series of contexts here that we're unaware of, but we got those particular contexts that we're aware of, that they are important, and the situation is unprofitable, if we were to spend a limited amount of money, we could figure out every single context, and we can fix every single context, right? Like, we can spend a bunch of time and resources on the ad, and spend a bunch of resources here and here and here, and then figure out what other hidden contexts there are, right? But in doing so, we're losing a bunch of money as we're fixing a situation that is unprofitable. We will ultimately reach success, but there's going to be a lot of money that's lost along the way. So that's why the first conclusion that I'm going to say, which is huge, but it doesn't seem like it's huge. It seems like it's obvious, but it wasn't obvious like a long time. And now that I'm going to say it, it will seem so obvious, but don't mistake the fact that it's so hard to have reached this particular conclusion, and how, almost nobody applies this correctly, right? And we have to value what we know for certain. So what the context that we want to operate in is a context is this sort of situation, right? There are a bunch of things that are unknown, and then we have like a known ad, and then we have a known product page, right? Which contains whatever, which contains the product, the price, and the other elements. And obviously there are other unknown contexts here, but we want this thing to be profitable from the start versus unprofitable. Right? So this is why I'm saying it seems obvious, right? But it wasn't, because if somebody says, well, pick something and then you're gonna make it work, instead of pick something that's working and make it better, it seems like, okay, in either case there's gonna be, like, if I were to say pick something that's unprofitable and you can make it profitable in like 5 minutes, or pick something profitable and improve it in 5 minutes, and in both cases it's going to reach the same amount of success, it seems like, oh well, it doesn't really matter, right? And somebody would have other priorities, arbitrary priorities, such as, oh, how much is the profit margin, or is it a particular niche that I'm confident in, or whatever, right? But it's like a huge difference from picking something that's unprofitable from the start to picking something that's profitable from the start, because in those 5 minutes, there's a bunch of like, after designing all those split tests, there's going to be a huge amount of money lost, because let's say the cost per purchase is like -50, and then it's being improved to -30, and then being improved to -10, and then being improved to 0, and then being improved to $10 profit. But in order for each to switch from 50 to 40, from -50 to -40, there's $1,000 in ads to make that improvement, and then another $1,000, and then another, and then another, right? So there's $6,000 spent just to reach the profitable situation. Whereas in taking something that's profitable and improving on it, then there's $5 profit, and then there's a bunch of split tests and whatever that's gonna make the situation get $10 profit, and then $20 profit. But alongside all of those tests, there was tiny profit, and then more profit, and then more profit, and then more profit, instead of a big loss, and then a smaller loss, and then a smaller loss, and then a smaller loss, right? Okay, now this is why it's so important to be profitable from the start versus unprofitable. And it seems obvious, but let's see, it's much more important than it seems. And because there might be the impression that other elements are important, but this is one of, if not, I think this is the most foundational context that we have to operate in. No, actually, probably I'm wrong, but it's something that I see. It's definitely not the most important, but it's more important that I know right now. Yeah. Definitely there are more important foundational contexts, but right now I don't have a more important one than this. Okay, so here I can say unknown context, and here I say unknown context. So my point is that we don't know why something is working. So we start with something that's working, that's profitable, although we don't know why it's profitable. And this is the thing. It's not required of us to know why something is profitable. Right? Now, if we were to invent a particular business from scratch, we would either have to be lucky, or we would have to know all of the context such that we can reach success, right? Or the important context. So it's either luck, or we would have to know everything that's important. The beauty with dropshipping is that we can copy others. And when copying others, we if they have a particular ad, so we call it the known ad, in a particular product page with the product and other elements, which is called the known product page, we have this. But we also have what's unknown to us, but we have it. Why? Because let's say that somebody's promoting a particular product, right? And we don't know the fact that the reason why that product is working is because there was a particular thing in the news which talked about how certain celebrities used a particular portable mouthwasher, right? You see how that's a huge context. The fact that a celebrity or a bunch of celebrities are using a particular product is basically the context that makes it work, alongside other contexts, but it's a hugely important thing. Now, we don't know the fact that the reason why it's working is because of that particular context. And that's why I say, when we're copying somebody, we're also taking the other things that we're unaware of, but we have them, and we don't need to understand them necessarily. So that's why it's so cool to copy others instead of starting something from scratch. Although there are, of course, advantages to starting from scratch. Right, so let's see. So this is the first thing that I wanted to say. Now, the obvious, let's move on to the second thing. Actually, let me put it into parts. Yeah, let me put it into parts, right? So let's say this is part one, where I talk about the first realization. And the first realization is the fact that the context that we want to operate in is where we are profitable with something from the start, even though we don't know why we're profitable with it. Okay? And it seems obvious and, easily dismissible, and of course, and, probably in a couple of days, you'd be like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. But how about, those other things? No, we have this, and we will build upon this, sort of like an animal that's evolving, right? This is the skeleton, and now we're going to put the flesh on this particular skeleton, right? We're going to value this, and everything that we're going to build upon, everything that we're going to build will be upon this particular thing. Okay? So this is the first context.